This is a continuous event, and it concerns alliances, realization, benediction, sublime, the space of silence, sharing, the inexplicable, an otherworldly intersection, what was needed, context or features, cross-modality, obligation, a meander. Alliances. One can't do it alone. We encounter remarkable individuals as life goes on. Sometimes there is a chemistry. One senses a tantalizing combination of resonances of complementarities. These encounters are unpredictable, infrequent, and very important. Don't let them slip by. Although one might think of the alliances that result from such intersections as friendships, that may not be quite it. It always seems to work out better if the members of such pairings live at some remove from one another, perhaps something to do with atavistic territoriality. If one can, one forms alliances where there is reciprocation, but, as it were, no accounts are kept. There is trust, no particular expectation, an unforced mutual interest and responsiveness. These relationships seem to be enduring. They are, of course, invaluable. I met Yuji Takahashi in Berlin and Paris through Xenakis. His mind has a disconcerting clarity and unconventionality. Karen signed one message to him, FFL. He asked what that meant. And she said, why, of course, it's friend for life. He would visit us in Del Mar each year. He would go on hours-long walks with our very young daughter. He would go to the UCSD library, find 5 scores of interest, learn them in a week, and perform an astounding concert. When Takahashi arrived in Paris to work with Xenakis, they did not immediately strike it off. But Yuji was able to show him that the absurdities generated by stochastic compositional procedures were, however improbably, realizable after all. They formed an alliance. Yuji ratified the potential of Xenakis' dreams. Realization. What a working relationship between a composer and a performer can do is to enhance the ways and the degree to which each understands the physical facts and the expressive intentions that arise in their interactions. An instrument is a complex physical system with which a performer builds a symbiotic relationship. An ability to inhabit the space of this system in a way that cannot be objectively comprehended from outside. Similarly, the impulses, the ideals, the struggles that a composer endures while trying to conjure up musical content can also seem unclear, misguided, even irrelevant from an outside perspective. I have enormous regard for the many wondrous performers with whom I have worked, and I would never imagine that I could understand how they do what they do. And it's not only physical mastery. I think of the intricate improvisatory landscapes that Mark Dresser summons from his bass. The potential of performer-composer relationships can hardly be overestimated. Yet, there is a difference between the two disciplines that often makes interaction less productive than it could be. A performer tends to feel his or her engagement with a musical opportunity as directed at the experience of public performance. It is towards such moments that effort is bent. Percussionist Schick speaks of the fear of public humiliation as one of his motivators. And sometimes the composer will come to feel that the performer for whom he is writing is the only one who can do justice to the work. I don't believe this is true. A particular performer eases the way towards understanding, for one, what an instrument and its medium contain, but I don't think it turns out that a particular performer is ever essential to the music one's creates. Benediction. Passing through or living in Paris, often from the early 80s onwards, I had occasion, many in fact, to visit Xenakis' fifth-floor studio. This is demonstrated for me by the many instances I've encountered in which a later performer brings to a familiar music dimensions and then walked up a circular flight of stairs, unexpected, arriving at a door. It was green, beyond which his studio lay. A hawk-like, cratered face greeted one with a crooked smile. The performer-composer feedback process. One could never be sure if the hint of irony that could be read was elicited. It can be forged. Is incalculable. The walls of the main studio space were lined high with shelves. One knows the relational character of the sounds one imagines, that features an expanse of but it is not possible ever to fully anticipate the effect that intentions will have. At the far left corner when they interact with the physics of an instrument and the intangibles of realization. Ashtrays, if pencils, one can hear passages in performance level realization, drawing implements, while the creative process is still going on. Other random objects were scattered. The results can be revelatory. Natural illumination from the left. Such engagements are rare. In the center of the space, several small easy chairs and an abbreviated table topped with books too large. Astronomy, Persia, mathematics, On the wall, I remember an irritating poster proclaiming twice an Ann Arbor event organized by Gerard Pape, recollecting the ambitious activities of our once group there in the early 60s. We would talk about whatever was occupying us in our lives, creatively, otherwise. There was never an offer or the expectation of a drink being served, nothing to snack on. It always felt a bit forced, awkward in the sense that this space, crammed with books, tape scores, sketches, architectural models, a space that had happened over the years without archival concept or intended evolution, was his, not a place for others. When the Xenakises entertained, it was a reciprocal experience, brimming with banter, good food, drink, and relaxed conviviality. It always involved Francoise and took place at their nearby apartment on Rue Chaptal. That was another matter. A high-ceilinged room, stunningly white. On our last visit there, I remarked on its vaulted lift. He said, "I fly sometimes, you know?" There was a challenging Picasso painting on the left wall, a set of sumptuous white couches in front of another huge painting, this by their daughter Maki. For dining, there was a glass-topped table with rude, notably uncomfortable wooden benches on either side. Their apartment spoke both of indulgence and denial. Xenakis, though curious and voluble, was not a storyteller. Imperious, strongly directed, often ironic, but alive to and warm with concern for those in whom he found interest. There was often a judgment of some sort at the end of an episodic exploration of whatever subjects drifted through our interactions, sometimes cutting, other times benevolent, at others unexpected and memorable in its ellipticality. The last time we met in his studio, his illness had begun to possess him. We had been seeking together sketches, documentation of any kind that related to the desert house that he had designed for Karen and me in the early 90s. Feeling the implications and threads of similar moments, they stretched back decades. And not knowing exactly how to close this interpersonal window, we stood at the studio door. I turned to leave and he said, "Not, take care, glad we could get together," nothing of that sort. No, he said, "Be intelligent." The door
少な
closed.
くとも一つながりのところは全部覚えてないと楽譜を見ながらやってる暇はないということなんですね。
Sublime. Webster's Unabridged begins not with poetics, but a physical perspective. To cause to pass from the solid to the vapor state by means of heat and again condense to solid form. Eric Partridge's classic etymological study, Origins, finds that the roots of sublime lie with limit and boundary, while subliminal suggests a presence below the threshold, presumably of consciousness, sublime rather suggests coming up from below the threshold, rising in the air, hence lofty. Webster's Unabridged Dictionary adds, to produce, purify, or release by heating a containing mixture, and to elevate or exalt, to render finer, as in purity or excellence. It then posits something grander, tending to inspire awe or uplifting emotion, usually by reason of elevated beauty, nobility, grandeur, solemnity. To court the sublime, then, we will need mixed content, something to be purified. Also a normative threshold that manifests the required boundary that is to be passed beyond through the application of metaphoric heat. Concatenating the references above, we see that it is not only necessary to rise from a lower position, but to become air, or better, vapor. The subject matter must become purer, losing tangibility without abandoning an essential palpability. We also need to consider returning, finding a way back to a more stable and also differentiated condition. Whatever the nature of the content at its threshold, where we are about to pass through a door to elsewhere, we must leave its multiple nature behind, and then, after some limited interval in an elevated state, return to a coarser nature. So the experience of the sublime is an odyssey. What are the components that might allow one to draw close to it? Certainly duration. There is no flash, such as we tend to report when speaking of inspiration. A quick drawing in of the breath as something that was not becomes clear. This time of passage involves the comparison of feelings, levels of comprehension, relationships, perhaps fearfulness, awe, even nobility or grandeur, then a suffusing surrender. On the way, we fleetingly negotiate between the already grasped and chimerical potential, still too distant to be confident of as an entity, let alone as an expected destination. One's more or less consciously held criteria regarding clarity, order, and symmetry are a part of this flickering negotiation, and it must be only intermittent so as not to disturb an engagement with the state shift required to get us airborne. Mere orderliness feels sterile, though it may be imposing. Think of the Washington Monument. And in the case of an orderliness bordering on the unacceptable, there can be an essential value to adding irregularity or asymmetry. Zen masters teach that an ennobling blemish can add value. The space of silence to an aesthetic object. Wesleyan University Press's announcement of the publication of Cage's Silence in Zen and Japanese culture. Young composers then, Daisetsu, were focused on Suzuki notes, changing the world. Where you would ordinarily have a line or a mass or a balancing element. I consumed it virtually without getting up from the table. And yet this very thing, serendipitously, awakens in Cage was coming to Ann Arbor, a feeling of pleasure. And I arranged to interview him. In spite of shortcomings, when the transcript of our interaction was published in C.F. Peters' A John Cage Catalog, he generously entitled it
interview with Roger Reynolds.
The favorable influence of a substantive irregularity
As,
or an
Robert
insistent
Ashley
micro-variability
a
of
reliable
essence or
microphone
understanding
and
is
tape
tangent
recorder set up.
to the orders
I asked to hold
and the
interview
complexity that come
in his
into
living
play in considering
I
ambiguity.
prepared carefully. Cage began the session by asking if I had actually read the entire book. Assured so, he remarked candidly it seemed that he had not expected anyone would. A good start. In that moment, perhaps because of the book, he saw the value of being clear, and was. Bob was present and asked whether he could insert a question. He said, "It seems to me that the most radical redefinition of music would be one that defines music without reference to sound."
In Barnett Newman and the Sublime,
John was unsettled.
Paul Crowther argues
He asked a few clarifying questions.
that Newman's
And then did what
abstractions
any
have
politician
great connotative power.
would. Shift the subject to ground he felt more comfortable.
This power hovers in the potentially
was a
ambiguous
precious
space between conventional representational
Watching
art
this
and
master
pure geometric
of invention,
abstraction.
indirection,
And the exploitation of this
Provocation,
semantic space takes the form of a
evasion,
combination of loosely biomorphic
and
and
inversion.
geometric elements.
unnerved by a younger generation, someone already building out from his provocations into a space he had not anticipated.
Elements that transcend mere mundane narratives of conventional representation. Newman himself uses the term ideograph to pick out symbols of this sort and defines it specifically as a character, symbol, or figure which suggests the idea without expressing its name. Here emerges the potential value of an ambiguity of essence. A central intention is implied, but not too palpably manifested. Of course, a clarity of the identity and intent of a component or its elements can be manifested without precision in the usual sense. Certainly, kinds of content properly involve or evoked or inferred precision or an order to produce an appropriate sort of specificity. The impression of a complexity that fosters sublimity can arise when order recedes. Components are indistinct, boundaries blurred, patterns elusive, impressions unaccounted for, or is densely manifested, a seemingly unmanageable proliferation of components. In Newman's art, the avowed intention of rectangular color fields violated by contrasting strips that he terms zips is to invoke sublimity. Ambiguity is his agent. We see roughly rectangular verticals. The field itself, its subtly and irregularly differing character, color balance, texture, size, alignment, is necessary, but less so than the actual subject, the impact of vertical delineation through the agency of zips. The normative, the threshold vertical, is subdivided into parts, but the trace of the parsing vertical itself can suggest effortless separation or a violent rupture that violates the surface field. A darker or lighter color or a changing hue can add a consideration of weight or flight. We pass from one to another element in a directed series of images in Newman's print set 18 Cantos, or the more majestic and referentially suggestive paintings in his Stages of the Cross at the National Gallery of Art. And as a result of this passage, we may find our moorings loosened. Sharing. Not only did John Cage make remarkable etchings and watercolors, four of which we are seeing here, But he also enjoyed cooking and said late in his life that he was working on a cookbook, sadly, an intention not completed. Some recipes were detailed, others were matter of fact, their restraint bringing a smile to one's face. Squash, etc. Bake without cutting open at 425 degrees for 1 hour and 15 to 30 minutes. Some, like rutabaga, need more time. If very large, possibly 2.5 to 3 hours. In earlier days, I took a red-eye from California to New York for a program presented by Lucas Foss's creative associates in residence at SUNY Buffalo. My interest had been aroused by the reappearance of a composer friend's name, Michael von Biel. We had organized events in Cologne at Mary Bauermeister's loft in the 60s. Michael, along with David Tudor, the announcement alleged, would assault a metal barbecue with amplified electric drills, among other implements of violence. And their performance was suitably appalling. After the program, John and I were walking out onto 57th Street. He said, "You look exhausted. Have you had anything to eat?" I admitted not, and we took a cab to his place. He improvised a simple, fragrant, crunchy, mouth-wateringly nourishing meal in a few moments out of what was at hand. My introduction to his engagement with the world of macrobiotic dieting he had acquired from Michio Kushi in Boston. Some years later, John and Merce Cunningham were giving a dinner. Their 18th Street loft was, as one would have expected, unexpected. Entering, one found that the right-hand wall was a thicket of plants. Tall ferns, bamboo, lent a fresh and damp character to the air. Indoors, one nevertheless felt out of doors. John was cooking, Merce bustling about, setting a large table opposite the forest, arranging the necessary dishes and commenting without sympathy on how long it was taking John to produce their promised meal. In the end, it was suitably magnificent. I remember especially small golden nugget swash, hollowed out and filled with homemade hummus, a drizzle of sesame oil and black sesame seeds on top. The components, and Merce and John, were complementary, each in its way effective, not without both the differences and resonances of the choice to share existence. inexplicable. We were in Amherst in 1988, where Emily Dickinson had lived. Somehow you could feel this. I was reading Helen Vendler's excellent volume of American poetry. One night it was John Ashbery's self-portrait in a convex mirror. In a fog of late evening fatigue, I worked at it. The next morning, I realized that things I had understood the previous night were no longer clear. There seemed something time-specific about comprehension. My understanding could not be extrapolated. It was not the case
Otherworldly
that if
intersection.
you understood something one day,
We moved to Japan in 1966.
that you would also understand it the next.
Many currents in the air.
This was very
Social
interesting.
turbulence, stylistic adventurousness in the arts as well as lifestyles.
I did what I usually do
Growing influence of technology.
when something seems just out of reach.
Media experimentation.
I write music about it.
I met Takemitsu.
Whispers Out of Time,
His passion,
a string orchestra piece that won me the Pulitzer Prize.
sharing, as we did at that time.
When
little
informed,
in the
I
way
sent a
of common
score
language.
recording to John.
We often went to the
He
cinema.
answered immediately that his poem had won
Absorbing
him his Pulitzer.
together.
He said I should visit the
At
next
one of
time
the
I was in New
ubiquitous
York.
small Tokyo
So I did.
bars afterwards,
John said
would
that he often
entertain.
writes poetry while listening
vocalizing with buzzing lips
Brahms,
and cupped
for
hands, he would
example.
conjure up Louis Armstrong.
We decided to collaborate on
He
a
knew
song
Dixieland
cycle,
as well
and
as
we
the
really
history
did.
of cinema.
I would visit him and say,
Subtle.
here are some poems I would like to set, and this is what I think about
He
them."
had had no formal
Then he
education
would comment
as a
and
result of
respond
the
to
disruption
my
of the
questions. Over time, I
Much
realized
of
that his
income
responses were
derived
always
not from the
different.
music for which he was
He would
already
sometimes
deeply
deny that he had said a particular thing in a previous meeting, something he had undoubtedly said. There was no point in pursuing this kind of understanding,
was
the kind that
always a welcome
seems
experience to
stable
share a work
once
which
gained.
he had composed. Over the years, these included Tachigahara's Woman in the Dunes,
John is fascinating,
Shinoda's Double Suicide at Amijima,
laconical,
and Kurosawa's magisterial Ran.
provocative.
When we first met, though, he spoke with particular feeling about Kobayashi's 1961 Kwaidan,
And always
itself based on an assemblage of the ghost stories that were so popular in Japan.
just out of reach.
For this project, Takemitsu had collaborated with Okuyama Junosuke, a renegade electronics engineer. Okuyama was interested in music, tolerant of composers, able to design analog electronic devices custom-made to achieve whatever effects might be desired. For Toru, he had created a set of boxes that disturbed the spectra of sound materials. These sound sources included dry branches being broken. I remember Toru's glee as he mimed the process. The sounds of the shakuhachi, a vertical bamboo flute,
What was
and those of the
needed?
biwa, a lute-like import from China. He had become an
While working at IRCON in Paris, I received an invitation to travel
because
to
of the
Japan for a
serendipitous
conference that would
proximity
bring together
of these
pairs of
kinds
American and
sounds
Japanese artists.
to that of the
There
elderly
would be
biwa master,
2 architects,
Suzuda.
2 sculptors, 2 theater directors, like the Ark. Takemitsu had asked that I compliment him. Meetings were held at the Hakone Hot Springs Resort near Tokyo. The timing was not ideal,
So that
as
he
work in
finally
Paris was at a
ventured
particularly
into prison.
intense phase, 7 days a week of late-night sessions, and I did not relish the long flight over Russia. Takemitsu indicated that he would be at his Karuizawa mountain retreat and proposed that I join him there for a few days of convalescence
Distinctly
before the
over-the-top
conference
backdrops
began.
for waterborne battles between
The invitation
historic
was
Japanese
tempting,
clans.
but the flight over Russia would now
Bizarre
be extended
howlings and
by a
shriekings
bus
of the
ride
shakuhachi,
into central Tokyo and a
whacks
train
and
to the
twangings
mountains.
of the traditional 4-string biwa,
By
The
the
ceremony
time I arrived in Karuizawa, I was a mess. He had anticipated this. We arrived on foot at his compact but elegant compound, and he said, "You take a bath now." Not at all. It all combined to unforgettably sluggish mind without yet having understood the implications. He showed me to the bathing room. It was surprisingly large, and at the far end of the right-hand corner was the tub,
warbled pitifully in the background.
deep,
At others it shrieked with an otherworldly,
inescapable sorrow, poised between invitation and threat.
a demented crossing of a banyan tree with a bamboo grove. Almost diabolical excess in the service of otherworldly tales.
The water rose to tub-top, a mirror-like surface from which steam rose. I undressed, squatted on a small wooden stool, and washed myself with the bucket of water provided. Ready now, I approached the tub and tested the temperature. It was shocking, unimaginable. I looked for a tap from which to add cold water. There was none. I searched for a temperature control. Nothing on the wall, nothing on the tub itself. I was now at least fully alert. The situation was absurd. I could neither imagine proceeding nor the shame of emerging without having taken the opportunity offered. Finally, resolve and the need to cling to a shred of personal dignity prevailed. I climbed in quickly, reasoning that there was no possibility of ill intent towards me. I was in. Horror intact, discomfort extreme. The hope was that my own body temperature would lower that of the water. The room was quiet, indifferent. I heard with disbelief an electric heater go on and realized that the tub was not going to adapt to my body's plausible temperature, but would assert its hellish dominion. But there was, as there is, gradual adaptation, and the effect intended did occur. Bones turned soft, muscles, tendons lost their structure. Finally, I extracted myself, not certain that I could stand, dressed and came into the kitchen. Toro was sitting at a wooden table whose top glowed in the afternoon sunlight. On it was a bowl of edame, cold, bristling with salt crystals. He opened the refrigerator and brought out 2 cans of Sapporo beer, no more than 2 inches high. They were icy cold. Context or features? Exactly. I was walking in Helsinki's Hesperian Park. I could not imagine anything more exact. We were talking about compositional strategies. This has been a theme in our interaction over the years. At any moment, I asked, how do you know what to do next? My interest was piqued by the uncommon inventiveness of his music that involves a continuous tumbling from one gestural, timbral, and textural world into an unexpected new one. Is this pure invention or the result of a kaleidoscopically changing set of challenges thrown at his imagination by a shifting set of conditions or preordained demands? I assemble a custom world of resources and opportunities for each work. It's not like that for him. He generates materials without knowing either where they will fit in the final product or whether they will be used at all. I know when I am, say, half done. He does not know where he is in the overall process until he decides to stop. Cross-modality. Perhaps this is connected to his personal circumstance. When Karen and I were He's a freelance composer who spends almost all of his professional time and energies on composition and art scenes there. Among the more outrageous theater
This is
groups
not a
at that
privilege
time was
we all have,
Suzuki Tadashi's
not
Waseda
the life
Shogekijo.
that everyone would
Later in the
choose.
80s, Takemitsu was involved in organizing a Japanese-American conference on the arts,
Devised
where each field
conventionalities,
had
landscapes
complementary
of
representation.
opportunity,
Suzuki was the
repertoires
Japanese
of
theater director,
resource.
Alan Schneider the American.
These
And so
convert
we came to know each other.
anything can be next.
We decided to collaborate.
Which of the things that I have prepared will I
He
use
took in
next?
concerts when my music was performed.
The importance
I went
of this
to rehearsals
distinction
of his incomparably
is
dynamic
fundamental for
company.
me.
Mel Gasso wrote in the New York Times of their glittering stairs,
After a while, you
even
said,
when completely immobile.
which of these things remains most
Suzuki
memorably
suggested that
after
during
an
the next year,
experience?
whenever I came across a segment, a
entire
few minutes
path you have
perhaps, of
followed?
music that I particularly
Or
enjoyed, I
a
should
few
send him
striking
a cassette.
moments during
After a year, we would meet and plan a project together.
decide to listen to a musical work again.
I did as he asked, and the next year we met at his company's summer home at Toga Village in the western part of Honshu. At our first meeting, he came into the room and said simply, "There is no space for me." The music I had sent him fully
They are the lure,
occupied his
the
senses.
reward for the investment of returning. In St. Petersburg, Karen and Lily saw
There was no
in
place
scene
for
2
his
of Act
actors.
1, the bewitched
For their
swan
words and
enters
views.
stage left.
Of course, this stood to reason. I thought
The
his
orchestra's
composers would work
concertmaster.
with the expectation
He
that
stood
our
throughout the
sounds will
scene.
be sufficient.
Spun
How
out
could it be
Tchaikovsky's enchanted
But this
melody.
intersection provided an
The
intriguing
combination
challenge.
of her live
Write music that one is willing to call
soaring
one's
mind
own,
constituted
but that leaves
a moment.
metaphoric
There
space
was no
for
doubt.
other kinds of information to be absorbed coincidentally.
Earlier, we saw
I
a
proposed to
guitarist near
Suzuki
Helsinki.
that I would compose
I
for
remember
two types
most
of music,
clearly
a kind
the
of
design
sonic
element
cloth, the
that
fabric
I got
that he
in
could
the
cut, stretch, copy, and so
Not
on
the
as he
house
wished.
itself,
And then
or our
also
passage through it.
some set pieces which he could
At the
use
Hermitage
or not,
in St.
but that,
Petersburg,
if he
the
did
crowds
use
were
them,
suffocating.
would have to be presented in their
No air
entirety
moves.
without alternation. He
Its
agreed.
impressionist treasures
A few
are
weeks
the gifts
later,
to
I
us
received his
all
proposal
of
he
the
planned
idiosyncratic eyes of Morozov
to work
and
on Chekhov's early play Ivanov,
After one almost
and he asked
literally
me to write
fights one's way out
religious
onto
music
the street,
and primitive
what
music.
remains? The sequence of rooms, the eras or cultures represented, the logias,
How I
or
interpreted
the
it
impact
was
of
up to me.
Rembrandt, Kandinsky, Monet, Matisse, singular images. I imagine awakening in a hotel, dressing, stepping from my room, opening a door across the hall and facing a never-before-seen image. It stays there. I stay there. No coercion. In fact, essentially, no context. No sequence. No proportion or timing of events. No growth or subsidence too. Nothing lesser, nothing greater. Moments and context. Can we do without either?
He also sent a tape of 4 Japanese pop songs, asking that I pick one to use as well. The ways in which Suzuki actually employed my musical offerings were totally unexpected and stunningly effective. He combined the religious music, for example, with a circular procession of amputee brides in wheelchairs, young women whose single legs emerged from white dresses like enormous index fingers that propelled them ceremoniously.
was that were he to have asked me to write music for such a scene, and then describe what he wanted to do with it, there was absolutely no possibility that I would have written something that would have been as effective as what happened as a result of our collaborative agreement. We knew something of each other's worlds. We made things. They came together in unanticipatable juxtapositions. It worked as a result of the artistic parity, the shared experience, the trust. Obligation, a meander. We say, I'm supposed to something or other. Implied in that usage is that a sense of obligation exists. An action is owed to something, someone, and by this phrase we openly admit something that might otherwise remain private, unrecognized. Both the tug of coercion and also probably our resistance to the implied course. Why do we reveal in this locution something that could as well go unspoken? Because something in us regrets the need to act and wants release from collusion with an implied obligation and its purposes. Thought of in another way, from the direction of speculation rather than obligation, a furtive aspect emerges in this phrase. It becomes an innocent remark, distanced and slightly didactic. It could mean, it is thought that. The passive construction shields one. The observation is simply that an unnamed other or others thinks, even expects, that something will occur. One's self is not necessarily implicated. It's supposed to rain tomorrow. This alternative involves a more relaxed sort of premise, taking note but requiring nothing. Perhaps in that sense, suppose opens a door to consideration by momentarily shining a light of recognition on it. But in this sense, the phrase need not feel troubling. I'm supposed to. The supposition may connect more to the feeling of expectation than to an implication of action itself. One does not welcome being or sensing that one is obligated, perhaps in general, but more probably in relationship to the person or the project that is thought to be the source of an anticipation that one should act. Venturing further along these paths, why would one engage in composing music? Is it in some sense essential? Surely there is not or ought not to be any coercion there, no, she made me do it. Does this then relegate such engagements to the realm of things that are, in a larger sense, not necessary, hence incidental, dispensable, perhaps belonging to the category of luxuries that one should be able to do without?
I proceed in two ways. I receive requests from outside for music. then from time to time I have ideas that I want to, of what I want to do. And so there's the meeting of those and some kind of
There are drives,
exchange takes place when I,
as inevitable as one's
my
awareness
music was
within the
finally
experience of
published around,
being and knowing that
1960.
one is alive.
and that catalog was
Nourishment,
made, has
surely?
our interview in it.
Self-preservation, homeostasis, love, filial,
Make a
or
preface
otherwise.
that would show the
The
different
sense that
kinds of
one
music,
is
because
acting
my
in
music
accord
is
with one's
captured
aesthetic sensibility need not be connected to obligation from without.
And I found that some ideas that
As
I had
it is internal,
started at such
it
and
is
such a
also
date,
in its
and,
essence not necessarily
and fell by
connected
the
to
wayside
communal
at another
demand.
and something that the history of my attention has been to pay attention sometimes to just one thing, sometimes to several things at the same time. And that some things remain interesting to me longer and some shorter.
Listening to the way computer musician Paul Hembree works in this clip from Marked Music, and of course to the way that Mark Dresser plays, I think about my interaction with him over the years and about the subject of friendship. Let's consider that subject for a moment in a more general way.
When one feels a particular response to another with his or her way of thinking, of being, it can seem as though such resonances are meant to be, that they should inevitably entail the proximity that fuels them. One should nourish, submit, embrace, reward, friendship. Friends should be together. And I don't mean a chatty gliding across surfaces with dozens of those others. Substantive friendship requires focus, a reduced aperture. It entails temporal commitment, so often one doesn't engage fully with it. One lets the realities of the world, geographic and other, control events. How much is lost thus? The satisfaction of exercising one's sense of aesthetic relationships is, first of all, personal. One feels good when it is working, and one finds oneself inside the emergence of an unfamiliar but engaging, rewarding, enveloping entity, a space that has not, one can believe this with absolute certainty, existed before. Friendship can, but may not, elicit such a conviction. So aesthetic engagement is self-fulfilling, and having filled full, one does then, think about those others. The ideal is that they will come into these previously non-existent spaces one has made and find thereby their own mental and emotional orientation slightly, momentarily, more substantively, lastingly altered. Art entails the gift of a certain and decidedly not a utilitarian realm of nourishing experience. Is friendship a gift? One is not obligated to accept either. As for art, it is not a diversion, though it may be employed to lesser ends, but rather something over which we wish to linger, seeking the playing out, the resolution of impressions not completely understood, of embryonic patterns not fully grasped, of beguiling cross relationships and local evolutions that promise something not already known. It is experience not yet had. Its satisfactions reside both in sensation itself and in the coming to know. Not everyone makes aesthetic spaces. It requires an engagement that could appear quixotic. The rewards of art, such as they are, may be ephemeral. Nevertheless, the act of making or engaging with it, as with friendship, is nourishing, valuable. Aesthetic experience is not supposed, no obligation.